So I'm delighted now to introduce Adolfo Mejía Montero, who will be speaking today on a very interesting topic and very important these days. The title of his talk is Place and Context in the Energy Life Cycle, a Critical Engagement with Energy Justice in Mexico. Adolfo has just told us that he finished his PhD just 2 weeks ago, right? He had his viva 2 weeks ago. He was based in the Department of Geography and Lived Environment at the University of Edinburgh. So we're really excited to hear, his findings. He's focusing mostly on issues of energy justice, community renewables, and energy transitions in Latin America. He has also published on the role of social resistance in shaping energy transitions in Mexico. So Adolfo will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I will then open up the floor for Q&A. And we'll try to finish around 6:30, 6:45 minutes. If you like to ask a question at that point, please use the raise hand function. You find it in the participants participants on the bottom, and then you can see the hand raise function on the right. And I'll also invite you to unmute yourselves and then ask your questions so that the speaker can actually see you asking the question. But if you don't feel like doing that, or you don't have the possibility of doing so, you can also write your question on the chat and we'll address the question for you. You're also welcome to write your question while Adolfo is speaking, and also comments, and we'll save the chat for Adolfo because it might be useful for him and for everyone also to see the discussion that is taking place. We'll be recording Adolfo's talk, and we'll post this recording on ILA's website. But don't worry, we won't be recording the Q&A, so it's just the talk. So feel free to voice your comments, and this won't be posted online. Okay, I think this is it for now. Over to you, Adolfo. Really happy to have you here. Perfect.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Very happy to be here also. And thank you everyone for being virtually here. It's really good to see you. And I want to talk about my research, which was in Mexico, in southern Mexico, in an indigenous territory. But before doing that, I would like to tell you something that I was just talking with also with Ainhoa and Natalia, and that is that my background is actually not on anthropology. I studied physics and I studied engineering in the University of Edinburgh. And I want to tell you a story about the first time that I actually engaged with wind power. It was during a visit to Whiteley Wind Farm in Scotland during my MSc. And the whole experience was very interesting for me. We were a very international group, around 45 students, I think in the MSc from 20 or more different countries. And we were transported from the university to this wind farm, who, now that I think about it, it looked pretty much like a desert, right? There was almost nothing around it. And all the different talks that we had as students from engineering was about how these wind turbines operated, how much energy they produced, the rate of these wind turbines, how they were built, how they were brought here. So it was almost like if these wind turbines were built in the moon or in some place that was disattached from some actual place or some context. And this was something that made perfect sense for us as engineering students and people who had a background on engineering. But after that, my academic career brought me more to the social side of renewable energy and renewable energy transitions. And the second time that I was able to engage with wind power was actually in my own country, in Mexico, in the southern part of Mexico, in Oaxaca, in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which has actually the highest percentage of indigenous population. It's around 32%, and is the second lowest state, let's say, in Human Development Index. More than 60% of the population in the region that I study experience some degree of poverty. So context actually began to be much more important for this case study, also because I was related to the country itself. This region has approximately 2,800 megawatts of utility scale wind power. And even if that's kind of like a modest number in global terms, according to Simony, Hawaii is the place with the highest density of onshore wind farms anywhere on Earth, right? So it's a very important hotspot for energy transition in Mexico, and a very important a hotspot for energy transitions also in Latin America, and has received increasing attention from academic communities who are researching on the social side of energy transitions in the continent. I began my study interested in energy justice. For me, was a really good conceptual framework because it kind of recognized the socio-technical nature of energy systems. So for me, it was really useful coming from a natural science background and building from all this technical knowledge. I wanted to know more about the social side of energy systems. And this concept started in around 2010, and it has been evolving. It was endowed with its first conceptual frameworks around 2013, and now it has been named by some papers as mature scholarships already, that has been able to create many different concepts and frameworks that are useful for exploring energy systems and its embedded injustices all around the world. I got when I was studying this PhD, when I was beginning, I started to get interested in these conceptual frameworks, especially this one from Heffron and Macaulay, and they were saying that it was possible to use energy life cycle kind of system in order to look at the different distributional, procedural, and recognition justices or injustices that happen in a specific energy system, and kind of like using the specific stages of these energy systems in order to look at them in a structured and systematic way. So this was very interesting for me, again, coming from a natural science background and having worked with these energy projects, and the different stages that they used in order to look at this energy life cycle was extraction, production, supply and operation, consumption, and waste. And this life cycle is normally used as a way to, for example, measure CO2 emissions coming from, I don't know, a specific energy system or a power plant, or looking at cradle to grave CO2 emissions or carbon footprint. So it kind of like makes sense to look at how different stages, these different stages of an energy system could have embedded injustices. And I wanted to actually use it and bring it to my fieldwork and see if it was as easy as it was proposed to use this kind of like systematic structured way to categorize injustices or justices in the case of wind power in Oaxaca. So what I did, actually, what I wanted to do at the beginning, it was a mixed methodology. I ended up using it and through my PhD, but in the first initial stage, I wanted to do some focus groups. And I actually planned these focus groups, and I did some pilots. At the moment, in 2017, I was doing an internship in Germany, and I organized these workshops and all these different pilots for focus groups with some students there. But 2 weeks before going to fieldwork in Mexico, there were two very strong earthquakes in the 7th and the 19th of September. And it changed everything. It changed the way I was going to do my research. It changed the way I was going to approach. It changed even the availability that I had for finding a place to even stay there. So in the end, I used a pre-existing stakeholder network that I had in order to become a volunteer in different projects that they have. One from the APIT, the Assembly of Indigenous People in Defense of the Land and the Territory. and I work with a program that they have to rebuild kitchens. It was mainly a program of a woman who was working on their collective conditions in order to help the group to build their own kitchens back, and also with an organization who was working closely with wind farms and receiving this funding to build sustainable housing and resistant housing. So it's my research took a much more, I think, like ethnographic maybe approach, and I was based more on participant observation. And after trying to do these focus groups in the Isthmus for a while, I saw that it was much better to actually switch to semi-structured interviews as my main method of study. At the end, I finished traveling to different communities, both with these different two groups, and on my own. A snowballing process took me to meet different people around the Isthmus. And here you can see a map. The ones with green is the different communities that I visited where they have wind power in it. There are 5 municipalities who have installed wind power. The ones in the south are the ones who were engaging with wind power at one point, but the resistance was so harsh in these parts that wind power was actually canceled. These projects were canceled at some point. In the end, I managed to do this 58 different interviews with different people. This snowballing process took me to do much more interviews with the opposition, with landowners who were local people rather than people from developers or people from the government who were mainly based in Mexico City. And that's how I took my data in order to transcribe these interviews and code them as trying to use the structure of the life cycle in order to see how well or how bad this life cycle framework was actually capturing the embedded injustices that coming from my fieldwork. In the end, the first thing that I noticed is that the framework itself, it wasn't talking about two very significant stages that a lot of people mentioned and that were key for the population. The first one was manufacturing, and it's also a very important stage in other life cycle frameworks, but they omitted it. And the manufacturing, it was more related to a discourse or a narrative of socio-economical development, right? For the population here, the wind power projects was promoted under a discourse of development, and it was promoted under a discourse of bringing jobs and bringing steady jobs to the region and bringing all these different socio-economic developments to the region in the way of stable long-term manufacturing jobs, doing blades, for example, for the turbines. However, until now, this hasn't been a reality locally, and there was some people who, especially landowners, for example, who told me that they were very disappointed with this. They were promised jobs for them or their children or other people. And for some papers that have been wrote recently, for example, they calculate that there's around 300 permanent jobs, mainly accessible, for example, for people with higher education, and that most of the jobs are coming from jobs like construction, for example, which last only 1 year, and they're related only to temporary jobs. And this is something that actually I was able to see during my interviews. Most of the benefits that were internalized by communities or by people living in the region was through these construction jobs, right? Rather than the manufacturing jobs that were in a first instance promised to the population. This kind of like the discourse that the developers use in order to mitigate the the people's anger or people's frustration or this break of trust was saying that it was something that escaped from their hands, that they were only electricity producers, and that they had nothing to do with these wider development strategies or policies that were actually on hands of government, right? So there was a break of trust between the government, the developers, and the community at different levels, and that for people there caused a break of trust and injustice itself. After this initial break of trust, there was some attempts, for example, to build some manufacturing facilities in places not necessarily in the region, but 2 hours away by driving, for example, from the cultural capital of the Isthmus in a place called Comitancillo. But kind of like the embedded injustices that happened and the lack of trust of the communities brought these plans to an end, right? And later on some interviews that I had with some people later on my fieldwork, they told me that they had meetings with these people in Comitancillo, that they told them about this the issues that might arise and the lack of trust that might arise with the developers and the lack of promises. So these opposition groups actually took these manufacturing facilities, they blocked them, and this never happened, right? So a previous lack of trust created a lack of opportunities for job who were initially promised. Also, a very interesting narrative that I found in the field was about oil spillage, which were connected with a lack of national manufacturing, right? So something that a lot of people show me and that they were frequently saying about how wind power wasn't clean at all. It was because of the oil spillages that wind turbines had, and that they were very concerned, especially people who was working from gathering or hunting, or that were very close to these natural areas where wind turbines were nearby. They were concerned to the oil spillages that came from the wind turbines. And it seems to be that it was because of this mechanical whirring, because of the strong winds in the isthmus. And some people told that it was because of lack of maintenance, a lack of pieces. For example, some developers told me about this manufacturing only in USA or in Europe, and that it was sometimes difficult to acquire these components to keep proper manufacturing, proper maintenance. So it's possible to see how these different stages from manufacturing to production to waste were actually interlinked, and it was difficult to point at one specific stage on the life cycle in which injustice or an issue in wind power was happening, right? So it was all the way behind from manufacturing, and it was the injustice was being perceived until the stage of waste, right, coming through production. So this was kind of like one of the ways that I saw that it wasn't so easy to just silo injustices and just to say, okay, there's an issue in this specific stage of the life cycle, but that is rather useful to see the energy system as a whole system operating from these different life stages, at least to underpin these issues or injustices. Another stage that was missing in this life cycle framework was construction, and that was very, very relevant for people who was living in the area. One of the main issues is that they refer to construction as the most devastating stage in wind power, and it was many times because of the clearance of vegetation in order to create the roads, to install wind turbines, and the bases to operate, the cranes to put the wind turbines in place, all the difficulties arising from heavy machinery being operated in these roads. So for people in the isthmus was very disturbing, and they mentioned different kind of impacts. For example, cultural impacts by damaging trees who had a long history in the region, or impacts to traditional medicine, systematic impacts, for example, to more than humans, and who reveal a deep connection to their traditional activities. So for example, there was the case of these people who told me that they were pushing these zanates, these birds, away because they were living in these quiet areas in the trees that they were clearing, and that the zanates had a very close relationship with agriculture for them, and that they were natural pest controllers, and they were carrying a series of ecosystem services for them, and that was actually a way to impact in traditional activities like agriculture. Some downstream effects also, for example, like for regional ecosystems, there was something that I found very frequently in different interviews about underwater supplies being damaged. So in order to make these wind turbines, you have to dig deeply, around 20 meters sometimes, in order to make the foundations for these wind turbines. And there was people who was wondering if that was hitting the underground beams that supplied water to the different streams crossing around the region, and they were reporting some issues, for example, lack of water in the wells, or less regular stream in water. So they thought that it was affecting the region in this way. There was also some serious conflicts over the socio-economic benefits of people. Was, as I told you, there was jobs on construction was a really big main income for socio-economic benefits. So there was conflicts at different stages. There was a conflict, for example, intra-community conflicts between landowners and the general population who was trying to access these jobs. So landowners, because they were having the project in their lands, they had a preference in order to be assigned these jobs, right? So they were closer to companies, and they were able to negotiate more easily with companies about having jobs in exchange of support, for example, or in exchange of having their lands. It was a closer bond with them than the general population. So this created intra-community conflicts between people in communities. But there was also a process of elite capture of benefits, for example, because there were pre-existing, they called them sindicatos. It was like kind of like unions, but not formal unions, who were controlling construction and material supply and all that. And these very big unions were many times associated by both developers and by people in the communities with kind of like mafia kind of groups. They were hiring, for example, they told me that they were hiring people to just push their interests and to battle over who was getting the benefits from wind power contracts, and for jobs, and for construction, and for supplying material. So this also generated not only these conflicts between the proprietarios, for example, the landowners and the unions, and these unions for seeing who get the jobs, but it also generated a series of conflicts and very violent conflicts in the community for getting these contracts and for materials and jobs. The other stage that I think is really important for this case specifically, which I think is, I added it not because I think that it should be in the life cycle stage, but because it was specifically linked to the case of Mexico, is the one of the indigenous consultation, right? So for any project to be built, in theory, it needs to go through an indigenous consultations since 2014, right? So these wind power projects were initially talked since 2000, and some people from the government in Oaxaca and the federal government opened a series of colloquiums to bring people from the industry, from wind power industry, to talk about how to create the regulations for having wind power development in the isthmus. And the focus was mainly techno-economic, so how to deploy the transmission and how to deploy the different infrastructure for doing this. But there was little consideration for this social dimension of energy transitions. Then after 2006, something like that, there are these different indigenous and peasant groups started to resist and to oppose against the wind power. The map that I show you, for example, show kind of like the pioneer case study for resistance against wind power in the Isthmus, which is the case of Mareñas Renovables, which in 2012 had to migrate from this area. It was rebranded and it was then relocated in the north part of the region. And from there, because of in the context of the Mexican energy reform in 2013, 2014, there was a critical junction which allowed the generation of new mechanisms such as the Indigenous Consultation. And because of that, now any energy project that wants to be built in indigenous regions has to obligatory made this indigenous consultation process. So in a way, this is the social expression of a life cycle stage that is obligatory in Mexico prior consultation. However, from the interviews and from the thing that I talked with some people, it seems to be very problematic to include this as a specific stage in the life cycle framework, because it is a project that will last 25 years, right? So it's very problematic to decide what are the needs on the community in that moment and what they want to sign, what they want to ask, and how is going to be their normal communication with the developers and with the companies is not really good. So there was a lot of concerns that even if they were doing this consultation, the promises and all these different agreements will be held. So this was problematic to be a specific stage in time, a consultation, if the project was such long-term. Also, there was a lot of different issues in the making of the consultation. For many people in there, not only people from opposition, but also people from landowners, it was kind of like a simulation process. It was a highly political process, and there was many different actors who were, who had a role to play. From landowners, for example, who they were say that they were much more politically active than other groups, and that they had economic interests, so it was easy for them to organize and to go to these consultations and just to overrun them and vote everything in favor, or have previous agreement with companies behind or before the consultations. It was also the issues reported about, for example, these construction unions who were playing a role into pushing the consultations process, also by intimidating, by basically trying to avoid people from rising and from having different opinions or opinions that could affect the actual outcome of the project as something positive. So because of this, in many ways, the consultation was actually seen as a way to legitimize projects in the Isthmus, and not as an open, free way to debate what did the community need and which will be the environmental impacts, or something more, more free. So, as a conclusion, very quickly, I saw that coming from this empirical evidence, it seemed to be useful, and I corroborated that it was useful to have this kind of systematic and structural way of thinking about the different injustices that can be embedded in energy systems. It's useful, for example, to say that there are some manifestations of injustices that will happen during the production, the stage of production, and that will be characteristic of the stage of construction, for example, that will be a characteristic of the stage of manufacturing. It was very useful in this way. However, the framework, the first thing that I noticed, that it lacked very specific, very important stages. For example, manufacture and construction that will be part of any energy system. So it needed to be built upon that. And also that, for example, from the example of this oil spilling from the wind turbines coming from an issue way back on manufacturing, it was very difficult to use a silo approach to say that injustices were kind of like embedded in a specific stage. And it was much more useful to use what Jenkins calls a whole systems approach, and to see the energy system as a whole, an interconnected whole that is not possible to be siloed or staged in this way. And that is also part of a wider justice system, right? So it's not only the energy system, as we saw in the first slide. No, it's not that you're building a wind power project in the moon, but it's placed in a specific context. And that's the next point, that is, there's a need to ground the framework into a contextual understanding of energy justice. So it's necessary to understand that these projects are being built in a pre-existent social, economic, political, cultural landscape that will make that specific injustices are framed or are generated in a specific way. And failing to recognize this pre-existing landscape will make that using this framework fails into capturing and identifying the different energies injustices that we can see in energy systems, right? So, well, just to end with a positive note, maybe, it seems to be from the information that I got also from people from opposition that wind power as itself as a technology might not be the issue, actually. There was actually some projects that people told me that they were trying to do since 2008. It seemed to be not very feasible until now, but there's some ideas of community renewables that they described, and that I also talked with some people before. So it seems to be that it's not wind power or like energy transitions, the idea that is being here on risk, but it's the context and how these different projects are advanced or are pushed or are created or are contested by different groups, how communities are included, how they are made part of a participative process, how it's about all the surroundings, right? And that's why I did the first slide about this place, which was almost desert, because it's not about the technology or the wind turbines itself, but it's about where it's being built, right? So I think that means that there's plenty of work for social scientists that are focusing on these human dimensions of energy and energy transitions in Latin America still. There's plenty of work to do. So, well, yeah, thank you very much. And if anyone wants to contact me, there's my email. And thank you much for hearing me.